Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'm going to be your host this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we're going to explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, Christmas is in the air.
Yes, it is.
Christmas was always my favorite holiday growing up. It remains my favorite holiday to this day, even though I'm increasingly surrounded by adults who seem like they can take it or leave it. Are you a Christmas person or not a Christmas person?
I would say on balance, I'm a Christmas person. I don't get too much into the religious aspect of the holiday, but the secular stuff, the togetherness with the family and gift giving, that's very enjoyable.
Yeah.
Even like giving a gift to the dog is fun for all of us,
That is true. Yeah. My family, we always give each other gifts for each other's pets.
Yeah.
So I get gifts for my dog and I give gifts for their cat, which is kind of sweet.
Yeah.
And Christmas carols in general are not the best musical quality, but there's something about hearing them at a certain time per year that just kind of makes it special.
Yes.
So it puts me in a warm and happy place.
Yes. And I'll just say in the age of Spotify, you get to curate your Christmas playlist. So all the crap gets removed and you're just the cream, the wheat and not the chaff.
Absolutely. In fact, I have a note in my to-do list to curate this year's Christmas list. I'll be doing that in the next day or two.
Yeah, go for it.
So from those warm and fuzzies, let's move on to a possibly dystopic view of the future.
As usual.
Right. And this question involves something that lots and lots of people have been talking about on the internet, which is what appears to be a sudden improvement in the quality of generative AI. And I'm sure you have a lot more to talk about what that term means. Which is basically for someone like me who I write books in my spare time. It's something I do for fun. AI is now getting to the point where it can start pretending to write fiction in a way that I personally find a little bit threatening, but I also find a little bit intriguing. And so I'm super curious, just not only as a writer, but also as a reader, at what point in our future are we likely to be able to sit down with a novel that's actually a good read and that was written entirely by a machine? And what might the impact on that be, not just in the arts world, but in the world as a whole? And then as on a deeper question, because we have to go to the deep questions in this podcast, what does the word art even mean if it's something that you can press a button and the computer prints out something which is as beautiful as some of the most gifted artists in the past might have been able to do? So I handed this big and thorny and detailed question over to you, and I'd love to hear what you came up with.
Yeah, well, thanks as usual for the question. And boy, that last one is a deep one. And in hindsight, when I was in the middle of the research, I felt like, oh my God, am I ever going to finish this? And I could write forever, talk forever about this. But at the end, I feel like a really interesting topic, and I'm glad that I got to tackle it. Let's start by saying that you sent me a few links to get me started on this topic, because I admitted at the end of the last episode that I had not spent a minute thinking about it. And one of the links you sent me was a piece by the technology reporter for the New York Times, Kevin Roose, who's done a lot of thinking and writing about this subject. I found his writing to be especially accessible as like a gateway for me into this topic. So I'm going to come back to him repeatedly over the course of this episode. And I want to start with a little case study that he lays out in the piece you forwarded, because I think it nicely tees up all your questions. So a guy named Jason Allen won the blue ribbon in the digital art category at this year's Colorado State Fair by using an artificial intelligence program, AI, to generate a work of art. It was one of the first known AI-generated works to win a prize, and it led to a backlash among artists who claimed that Allen cheated. Mm-hmm. It also triggered fears among serious professional artists about whether people would continue to pay for art if it could be generated so easily by mere amateurs.
Yeah.
Alan is one of those amateurs. He runs a studio that makes tabletop games, and he didn't even start experimenting with AI to generate art until earlier this year. He used an AI bot called Midjourney, into which he typed a series of words describing the art he wanted to create, and it came back seconds later with an image containing what the Times described as hyper-realistic graphics.
Yeah.
Now, Alan claims that he entered the state fair competition not for his own aggrandizement, but to bring attention to what Midjourney and similar AI programs were capable of. He credited Midjourney in his submission, and while the judges didn't know it was an AI program, they said later that they would have awarded the prize to Alan even if they had known. But that's not what's important about this story, in my opinion. The important part is the controversy it generated, with some artists declaring the death of artistry right before our eyes. Others defended Alan, stating that using AI was not much different from using digital image manipulation tools like Photoshop, and pointing out how it took human creativity to think of the right text prompts to generate art good enough to win the award.
Right.
I want to point out here that controversy about new ways to generate art is nothing new. The printing press was decried by many as the death of storytelling. Artists looked askance at the invention of the camera. In 1859, the French poet and art critic Charles Baudelaire called photography, quote, art's most mortal enemy, end quote. Now, Gordon Parks or Dorothea Lange might disagree with that assessment.
Yeah, Ansel Adams as well.
Yep. Video art was thought of as lowbrow in the 1960s, but is now mainstream. And in the late 20th century, critics dismissed digital editing tools and computer-assisted design programs, claiming they made it too easy for the people who used them. So I think we need to acknowledge these prior reflexive moral panics and make sure the objections to AI-driven art are not just more of the same.
Yeah.
So we should also understand that whether artists lose commissions to AI is a decision made entirely by human beings.
Mm-hmm.
The Blue Ribbon winner, Jason Allen, when asked about this quandary, suggested that artists' anger should be directed not at people like him who use apps like Midjourney to make art, but at companies that choose to replace their human artists or graphic designers with AI.
Yeah.
Quote, it shouldn't be an indictment of the technology itself. The ethics isn't in the technology. It's in the people. End quote.
True.
That resonated with me. And for what it's worth, Midjourney, which has only 11 full-time employees, describes itself as, quote, an independent research lab exploring new mediums of thought and expanding the imaginative powers of the human species, end quote. Not exactly the big bad technology wolf.
Yeah. In my experience with using these tools is that it's just a lot of fun. Like I really appreciate the power, the surprising power of something like Midjourney, because I can put in a text prompt and just be astonished at what comes out of that. There's a joy in that would have been inaccessible to me as someone who's not able to sketch, let alone paint.
Yeah, I hear you, and I'm going to say the same thing a little bit later when I start to discuss how I use the AI. But yeah, it's not a terrible thing. The director of the new museum in New York City, Lisa Phillips, attributes artists' uneasiness about AI to, quote, the prospect that machines are going to take over. What are we unleashing? End quote. This, too, is not new. I'm a huge Twilight Zone fan, and that series, which was on the air from 1959 to 1964, is full of stories about robots taking over for humans. It's a fear that was in the zeitgeist at that time, much like the fears about AI-generated art today. Now, that's not to say that there aren't real-world ramifications to AI's infiltration of the art world. Jason Allen received a token cash prize of $300 for winning the Colorado State Fair, but elsewhere there's big bucks in AI-generated art. In 2018, the first portrait generated by an algorithm came up for auction at Christie's in New York and sold for $432,500.
Wow.
More than works by Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein offered at the same auction.
Wow.
Yeah. Art collectors are regularly purchasing AI art for five-figure fees and above. Museums and exhibition spaces have been mounting shows that feature AI art for a few years now. The AI technology used to make art is growing by leaps and bounds. Take DALL-E 2, an app created by the San Francisco company OpenAI and named after Salvador Dali and the Pixar movie Wall-E. It uses a process called diffusion, in which random series of pixels are refined repeatedly until they match a given text description to create art based on that description. Earlier this year, Kevin Roos helped beta test the system and included some of the images he generated in a piece for the Times, as did Andy Baio for his self-published website Waxy. I'm going to list both reports among my sources on our Facebook page so you can see the results, which are impressive.
Yeah.
The images they created with DALL-E 2 are already 4 times as detailed as those produced by the first incarnation of DALL-E, which was released just last year. So that goes to your point about the rapid advances of this technology.
Yes.
4 times better in just a year.
Yeah.
And in June of this year, Cosmopolitan magazine used DALL-E 2 to create its cover image of what looks like a female astronaut walking on the desert surface of a faraway world, which took all of 20 seconds to generate.
Yeah. And the thing about these tools is if you don't like that version, there's usually a function to come up with variations on that version. So you can tweak it and tweak it and tweak it again until you have exactly the thing you're looking for.
Yeah, right. Advances in AI art are only part of a larger story about advances in AI generally, which I'm proud to say we've covered on Mansplaining in several prior episodes, focused on deep fakes, autonomous weapons, workplace robots, and self-driving cars. Such advances have blossomed in the last decade as researchers work to perfect techniques like deep learning and the introduction of specialized hardware for running huge, computationally intensive AI models. In the area of music, AI has been imitating the work of famous composers for several years now. Researchers at the Sony Computer Science Laboratories in Paris created the world's first AI pop song in 2016. It's called Daddy's Car and is supposedly in the style of the Beatles. But I'm a big Beatles fan, as you know, Mark, and it sounded to me more like an Eastern European Partridge Family cover band.
Oh my God, John Lennon is spitting in his grave at the Beatles comparisons.
Yes. Now, Sony followed that up with Deep Bach, which used the same machine learning technique to compose music that sounds structurally, rhythmically, and harmonically like Bach chorales.
Wow.
Purveyors like the AI music platform Loudly describe it as Roblox for music creation and present their service as a way to revolutionize composing, quote, by allowing even more people to contribute as creators. Allowing people with little to no music production experience to create high-quality music has never been an option before, end quote.
That also builds on something that's been available for a while, which is there's long been keyboards that will put in like a drum track for you or like a synth line.
Yes.
And they also sell it as this is the way that you, knowing nothing about music, can create music. So this is kind of just the latest generation of that sort of tool.
Yes, true. But it's getting very, very sophisticated now.
Absolutely.
Even faster progress has been made with the deep learning models built by Google's DeepMind. 5 years ago, its AlphaGo product defeated the world's best players of the board game Go.
Mm-hmm.
But last year, AlphaFold, a new system descended from the one that played Go, accomplished something much more significant. As Kevin Roos explained, quote, using a deep neural network trained to predict the three-dimensional structures of proteins from their one-dimensional amino acid sequences, it essentially solved what's known as the protein folding problem, which had vexed molecular biologists for decades, end quote. This was such an important advance that Science magazine named it 2021's Breakthrough of the Year.
Wow.
And it yielded almost immediate dividends as this summer, AlphaFold predicted the structure of nearly all 200 million proteins we know of, producing reams of data that will aid in the development of new vaccines and drugs for many years to come.
Yeah. In a nutshell, that's kind of a snapshot of the way these things advance so rapidly that you hit a point where the algorithm solves a problem, and then suddenly so many other problems that are related to that one are solved, that it just seems overwhelming in a way.
Yes. And that same a fast and furious pace of advancement is true in the world of AI text generation, which you already demonstrated when you read the first paragraph of that Mansplaining murder mystery you commissioned from AI.
Right.
Google's large language modeling AI product, Lambda, was in the headlines earlier this year when one of Google's senior engineers was fired after claiming that it had become sentient. Though that's highly doubtful, it's fair to say that systems like Lambda are becoming really good at having spookily human-like text conversations.
Yeah.
OpenAI has its own natural language system called GPT-3 that can write screenplays, argue complicated positions, develop video games, and even code.
Yeah.
With the permission of his editors, Roos used GPT-3 to write a published book review for The Times last year. OpenAI also has a chatbot called ChatGPT that answers questions in a clear, well-punctuated prose and might someday replace internet search engines like Google, provided its developers can figure out how to stop it from cranking out misinformation.
Yeah, I've been using ChatGPT lately. And the problem with ChatGPT's responses is that, well, first off, they look terrific. The English is absolutely impeccable. It nails the grammar of conversational English, and I can only salute the developers for that. But what some people don't really seem to understand about AI is that the AI does not actually understand what it's telling you. What it is breaking down your question into an array of words and then coming up with what its statistical algorithms predict to be the best response to those words with words that it sends to you. So it's pulling from pretty much the entire internet as a data source and constructing what it predicts to be a good answer to that question, but it doesn't actually understand the question. So it doesn't know, for instance, if it's pulling on an essay that's both about the philosophies of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, since they were contemporaries, if that answer contains arguments made by Hobbes and Locke and presented as if it's just from Hobbes, when in fact those two figures actually disagreed with each other.
Right.
So it's both really good and also really suspect, and to such an extent that I've heard people suggest that the wave of teaching in the future is to present you with the answer to a question, and then your assignment as a student is to evaluate that answer.
Oh, that's interesting. But the technology is like, it sounds, what you're saying is it's kind of simultaneously super smart and super dumb at the same time.
Yeah. The way I like to think of it is artificial intelligence is not intelligence. It's a simulation of intelligence.
Yeah.
And the simulation is getting really good to the point where there's a smaller and smaller difference between real intelligence and simulated intelligence.
Right.
But it's still a simulation.
Yeah. So I want to say one other thing about the misinformation I mentioned about ChatGPT. So Meta unveiled last month a large language model for science they called Galactica, but it was withdrawn after just 3 days after spitting out tons of what the MIT Technology Review called biased and incorrect nonsense. One of the reviewers wrote, quote, "It just makes shit up," end quote.
Yeah. There's a premise to machine learning, which is garbage in, garbage out, because you have to train your algorithm on a data set. So they're not coming at this from nothing. They're pointing their algorithm at a prior data set of information about that problem, or just a general data set like internet content.
Yeah.
And if there's bias in the data set, there's going to be bias in the output from the algorithm, because the algorithm doesn't know what's biased and what's not.
Right.
So if you train your algorithm on racist content, your algorithm is going to be racist.
Yes.
And similarly for sexist content and whatnot.
Yes. And indeed, when I get to the criticisms of this AI, I'm going to talk more about that. So you're anticipating where I'm going with this.
Okay.
So what makes the new breed of AI tools different, as you just kind of alluded to in a minute ago? It has less to do with the art they make than with the way they make it. GPT-3, DALL-E 2, and Midjourney are all examples of generative AI. That's an umbrella term to describe AI that doesn't simply analyze existing data, but creates new data in the form of images, text, videos, and code. They're neural networks built by scraping millions of images from the internet, then training algorithms that enable the AI to recognize patterns and relationships in the images or the text, and devise new content that's stylistically like the training data, but not identical. Thus far, text, audio, and image generative AI are the furthest along, probably in that order. But nearly all the companies in this space plan to expand to video, with Google and Meta already releasing video generation products this year. Because of explosive growth in the last year or two, Midjourney now has 3 million users. DALL-E 2 has 1.5 million. Image and text generating apps are attracting hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital. The shiniest object of all right now is a free open source AI image generating model called Stable Diffusion that you can run on your home PC, and whose source code was downloaded by 200,000 users in the first 2 months after its release in August. Stability AI, the company behind Stable Diffusion, believes that putting a generative AI product into the hands of many people democratizes AI, and that the radical freedom it offers is a corrective to the otherwise pervasive paternalistic influence of big tech on content creators.
Yeah.
Stability's founder and CEO, Emad Mostaq, chose, shall we say, interesting imagery to describe what his company is up to. I quote, "So much of the world is creatively constipated, and we're going to make it so they can poop rainbows." End quote.
Nice.
Yeah. But that kind of radical freedom comes at a price. Aside from a basic safety filter that can easily be disabled by users, Stable Diffusion is doing nothing to block or remove violent, pornographic, or copyright infringing imagery, which has already led to a glut of anime pornography on Twitter and the inundation of Reddit forums with non-consensual nude images. I goofed around with Stable Diffusion's search engine, and I was indeed able to generate images that included nudity, celebrities, and nude celebrities. Though the people weren't always recognizable, and the image quality was often bizarrely grotesque.
Yeah.
I'm going to see if we can post a few of the images I created to our Facebook page with my text prompts so you can see what I mean. What Stable Diffusion is doing sounds to me like an honorable but perhaps naive gesture toward transparency and democracy that may inadvertently end up backfiring by inviting regulatory scrutiny on the entire industry. But not everyone feels that way. Andy Baio called it, quote, another example of techno-utopianism unmoored from the reality of the Internet's last 20 years. How an unwavering commitment to ideals of free speech and anti-censorship can be deployed as a convenient excuse not to prevent abuse, end quote.
Yeah.
Jack Clark, a Stanford academic responsible for its annual AI Index report, used a seasonal metaphor to describe the current state of generative AI. Quote, it feels like we're going from spring to summer. In spring, you have these vague suggestions of progress and little green shoots everywhere. Now, everything's in bloom, end quote. All that blooming is changing the conversation in Silicon Valley. Instead of predicting that world-changing AI is decades away, many who study tech trends now think major change is closing in fast. 2 years ago, Ajaya Kotra, a senior analyst with Open Philanthropy, estimated there was a 15% chance that by 2036, we'd have transformational AI, which she defined as AI sophisticated enough to lead to large-scale economic and societal changes, for example, by eliminating many or even most white-collar knowledge jobs.
Yeah.
This year, 2 years later, Ms. Kocher raised her estimate from 15% to 35%, citing the rapid improvement of systems like the GPT-3 that Ghost wrote Kevin Roos's book review in the Times. But what does all this progress in AI portend for art? Because that's what your question was about.
Yeah.
And by art, I mean not just visual art, but what my trusty Merriam-Webster Collegiate Dictionary defines as, quote, the conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects, end quote. Before we even get to the fate of the artist, there are a host of moral issues to consider about the scaling up of generative AI. OpenAI already acknowledges the racial and gender biases in the image base the AI is scraping to train itself, which is what you were talking about a minute ago. And OpenAI is making strenuous efforts to keep users from generating violent or sexual content or depicting celebrities. And of course, one of the cruel realities about these first iterations of generative AI is the way they benefit from the work of artists without their knowledge or consent. Artists who upload their work to the web are unwittingly training the algorithms generating the digital art that might someday render them unnecessary and or unemployed.
Yeah.
It must be galling to be one of those artists, your life's work scraped from the internet to train commercial AI bots to generate art in your style without your say-so and with no way for you to opt out.
Yeah. Can I run a thought experiment past you, though?
Yeah.
If you go to any major arts museum and you go through the gallery of famous and beautiful paintings, at some point you're going to see an art student there sitting and copying that work in order to learn about brushstroke and color and composition.
Yes.
Is it that different if the student being trained is a machine than a human who's also sitting there without the artist's consent and copying the work without the artist's consent with the intent of producing their own work, which sends no benefit to that artist? How great would you say the difference is?
Yeah, you make a good point. I'm just not sure. I'd need to think more about what the ultimate aim of all this scraping of millions of images is for the AI. You know, if ultimately big tech is going to monetize the AI and take over the jobs of human beings, that's a little bit different and more nefarious than what the art student is doing, you know?
Yeah. I mean, sure, the scale is different.
Right.
But I feel like for me, my reaction to scraping millions of images I'm more comfortable with that than if they were training the AI on a single image. Like if they were a Picasso bot that was just trained on Picasso, I could see where the estate of Picasso would be pissed off about that.
Yeah.
But if you are basically scraping all the world's art, then in a way that abstracts it to art capital A in a way that doesn't single out any individual contributor. And you're just trying to define algorithmically what art is.
Okay, fair enough. I see you're not persuaded by some of these first reservations I brought up about the use of AI in art, but let me continue and see if any of these others might resonate for you.
Okay.
So Andy Baio, this essayist who I cited a few times, he names this phenomenon the ethics of laundering human creativity. And I think he really put his finger on some pressure points. Now I'm going to quote him. Is it ethical to train an AI on a huge corpus of copyrighted creative work without permission or attribution? Is it ethical to allow people to generate new work in the styles of the photographers, illustrators, and designers without compensating them? Is it ethical to charge money for that service built on the work of others? End quote. Now, I'm a rights and clearances professional, and this strikes me as a humongous copyright infringement lawsuit waiting to happen. OpenAI must agree with me because they already removed some celebrity faces and Disney and Marvel characters from their image training set to head off privacy and infringement suits from some notoriously litigious parties. Some of these offended artists are taking the fight to the technologists. An artist collective built a search tool called Have I Been Trained? So artists could search the 5.8 billion images used to train Stable Diffusion to discover if their work is part of the training set, and then to opt in or opt out of appearing in future training sets. After Stability AI announced it was open to working with that tool, more than 1,800 artists signed up, with 60% choosing to opt out. In searching for their work, some artists discovered that their private medical photographs had also somehow been sucked into the training set.
Yeah, that's a HIPAA violation, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Meanwhile, other artists lamented how the battle was already lost. Carla Ortiz of the Concept Art Association told The Guardian, quote, "It's like someone who already robbed you saying, 'Do you want to opt out of me robbing you?' End quote." So that's the dark underbelly of this phenomenon. But not everyone sees the rise of AI as all doom and gloom for artists. Writing in Wired magazine earlier this month, Katie Ilanka Giro, a PhD in computer science who studies human-AI interaction, speculated that writers might grow to think of text-generating AI as, quote, "a half-decent writing buddy who at least wants to do what they ask, even if it doesn't always succeed, and has no desire to take any credit."
Yeah.
She separated writing into 3 separate processes: planning, drafting, and revising, and spoke to writers about what parts they might agree to let AI help with. She found that planning out the work, coming up with the beginning and ending of the story and the plot points in between, was something writers thought of as the tricky, intellectually engaging part of their work, the part that felt uniquely human. Whereas the act of drafting, of translating one's amorphous ideas into specific words on a page, often leads to writers getting stuck and having to figure out what comes next, a task for which AI is uniquely suited. Giro listed a bunch of AI writing tools that help writers get over that hump while also leading them in fresh and unexpected directions. Imagine a writing caddy that can remove the tedious parts of your writing that you'd be happy to let go, so you can focus instead on the parts that are most dear to you. And as for revision, writers have relied on the editing profession for that service for ages. So you'd think that AI programs would be all over this, but they're not yet, though Giro sees this as a growth area for AI development. Quote, computers may become early stage editors, giving writers an ability to get feedback before showing their work to someone more important, end quote. So I'm just curious, Mark, since you've been writing, does that make sense to you, the way she laid it out, and how the AI might be useful in the drafting stage?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because there are two types of writers, and they're called the planners and the pantsers. And the term pantser refers to a seat of the pants writer, where you sit down and you write it out from beginning to end, and you have no idea where you're going to end up. I have no idea how to write that way. So when I'm writing, I plan it out from beginning, middle to end. So I know where the story's going and I know what each chapter is supposed to do. But knowing what each chapter is supposed to do doesn't mean I know what the next paragraph is going to need to say. And so sometimes I just find myself staring at a piece of paper and not really knowing where to go.
Yeah.
And lately I've been playing with a writing assistance tool, an AI assistance tool called PseudoWrite. And one of its cool little functions is that you can give it one or two paragraphs and say, keep writing this thing. And it spits out content, and that content is never the thing that I would have written. It goes in a different direction. It involves elements that I wasn't planning on including because, of course, the AI doesn't know what's in my head. But I found that it's very useful as sort of a straw man representation of what I don't want. So if I look at that, I think, okay, not that, but this other thing, and then suddenly I'm writing again. So it's an interesting partnership with the machine in which you're asking it to write bad copy so that you have a better picture of what good copy looks like.
Yes. It also sounds exactly like what Katie Guerra was describing in Wired magazine. So I would say you probably agree wholeheartedly with what she's saying there.
Yes, and I'd go further to say that I don't just write fiction in my spare time. I make a living as a communicator and as a writer, and I feel like these sorts of tools are going to become indispensable aids to anyone in my line of work, where you are going to be working on copy, but you're also going to have an AI to suggest different variations, to tweak it, to comment on it, like you say.
Right.
And it's going to be a partnership going forward between the human worker and the machine.
Right.
And then the question in terms of job security is, at what point does the machine become so good that the human part of it is not needed anymore?
Right. Many folks in creative professions wonder whether the ascendance of AI will become an existential issue in connection with their employment prospects. Illustrator R.J. Palmer is quoted in The Guardian stating his main concern as, quote, "What this does to the future of not just my industry, but creative human industries in general," end quote. The fantasy illustrator Greg Rutkowski, whose name has already been used in hundreds of thousands of AI image generation prompts in just the few months since it's been publicly available, told MIT Technology Review that he probably won't be able to find his own work anymore because the internet will be so flooded with imitations. In the near term, is it logical to assume that there will be fewer jobs for illustrators, fewer sales for providers of stock photography, fewer people in the editing business? I would say that's likely. Rapidly improving image-generating AI may soon be used in place of stock images. In fact, the huge image library Shutterstock recently did a deal with OpenAI to add DALL-E to its offerings. Commercial artists who illustrate books, magazine articles, and album covers are almost surely to face competition from AI.
Sure.
And that brings me at last to your most intriguing question, the one about what art even means when it can be generated by a computer. Writing in The Guardian, Laurie Clark posed a similar question. Here's how she put it. Quote, "If everyone can harness AI to create technically masterful images, what does it say about the essence of creativity?" End quote. To help her with the answer, she interviewed Anna Riddler, a conceptual artist who uses AI in her work and is keenly aware of its shortcomings. I quote again, "AI can't handle concepts, collapsing moments in time, memory, thoughts, emotions. All of that is a real human skill that makes a piece of art rather than something that visually looks pretty." End quote. She then offered a compelling example of this concept. Type the words astronaut riding a horse into any of the image generators, and you'll get a pretty accurate rendering. But type horse riding an astronaut, and you'll get more images of astronauts riding horses. I tried this myself, and it's true. As Clark put it, quote, AI doesn't really grasp the causal relationships between different actors in the world, end quote. In other words, putting the horse on the astronaut does not compute precisely because it requires in its creator the essence of creativity.
Sure.
I also like Katie Alanka-Giro's point of view on this question. She writes that she doesn't think generative AI will be outcompeting the work of human authors anytime soon, but not because AI won't be good enough, as it may well become good enough in time. It's because, quote, we will be far more interested in what a person has to say, end quote. She thinks that readers and the larger culture, as opposed to writers, will eventually draw the line of what's acceptable by defining, quote, where authenticity or truth really lies, in a way that respects what we really value about writing, end quote. Simon Ings, writing about AI-generated music in the science and technology magazine New Scientist, agrees. I quote Ings, if the point of music is that it conveys emotion, it is only interesting if there is a human doing the conveying, end quote. Yeah. And that's where I come down as well. After screwing around with the image and text generators, which was quite fun, I agree with you, Mark. It gave me a lot of laughs. It's easy for me, a non-artist, to imagine a world in which we outsource writing, illustrating, and music making to AI apps on our PCs or phones to save time and money. But to imagine that is to underestimate the role of the artist and what art is really about. Remember that definition of art I read earlier. The conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. Consciousness, creativity, imagination, and then aesthetics, the appreciation of what's beautiful or pleasurable to the senses. The common denominator of all those words is humanness. Art is something humans do for other humans. The humanity on both sides is central to the experience. Generative AI apps are made by humans, but are not themselves human. They're not artists, nor is Deep Blue a chess player, for that matter. Just because sophisticated apps are trained to play chess, or generate sentences, or draw pictures, or string musical notes together, doesn't make them chess masters, writers, illustrators, or composers. But let's reconvene when the technology becomes sentient, shall we?
Yes. Yeah, let's. If it's not a smoking road, if we've not entered the world of the Terminator at that point.
So what do you think?
I have so many thoughts.
Yeah.
So much of what you were just going through, like the essentially human aspect of art, and that it conveys an emotion and an intention. I would like that to be true because I'm an author who would like people to buy and read my books. I want to connect with an audience. I do not fondly imagine a future in which Amazon.com is flooded with AI-generated books, and so that it's even more difficult at that point to find an audience because there's just so much material there that can be generated at the literal press of a button. So I want that to be true. But I kept thinking about the Rorschach test, which is just an ink blot, a completely meaningless swirl of ink on paper, and that a therapist asks you what you see in that, and people see something in the Rorschach blot. And there's nothing in the Rorschach blot, but that doesn't stop us from seeing something in it. And so I wonder what it is about AI art or AI non-art that's going to keep us from seeing emotion and intention in it if we are capable of seeing emotion and intention in other things which manifestly lack those qualities.
Interesting point, Mark. So you're basically rejecting what I spoke about earlier about how one writer's thought that readers, the audience, is going to determine what's important in art, and it's ultimately going to come down to human beings communicating with human beings.
Yeah.
You're basically saying that people are going to read that novel generated by AI and sold on Amazon and find in it what they would find in any book written by a human being. And so the bot could become a best-selling author in your mind.
Yeah, I'm suggesting that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that we can find beauty in something that a machine generates, and that it does not depend on beauty as being part of the intention of the author. That just feels like more of a description of the world we live in than the ideal world that I would like to live in which a reader is going to judge my book to be intrinsically better than a book generated by an AI. I'm not that confident that that would be the case.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what I think about this. I mean, while you're speaking, I was thinking, well, maybe in the truly outstanding works of art, like you look at Picasso, Guernica, or something like that, or Starry Night by Van Gogh, and you just recognize the genius in that particular piece of art. And maybe, just maybe, AI will never be able to simulate that. Will not be able to generate anything that just wows people.
Yeah.
They might create AI music, but it ain't going to be Hey Jude, you know?
Yeah.
It just can't possibly be Hey Jude, because Hey Jude is infused with emotion and experience of the world and compassion, you know?
Yeah.
And so maybe what I'm saying is there will be AI art. It will sell, but it will never be in anybody's pantheon of art.
What I would love to see, based on what you just said there, is a Turing test for art. And the Turing test, for anyone among our listeners who doesn't know, is a classic test of the quality of artificial intelligence, where test participants sit at a terminal and they have a conversation, and they do not know whether or not their conversation is with another human being or with an AI. And at the end, if those participants are unable to tell the difference between a human and an AI, then the AI has passed the Turing test. And I would love for there to be a Turing test for art. Let's have a contest in which 10 of the entries are from human artists and 10 of the entries are from AI, and see the extent to which people can judge things in terms of emotional power. And does that emotional power accrue to the human artist, or does it accrue just to the pixels on the canvas? And in that case, it's the viewer who's infusing those works of art with that power.
Yeah.
And I honestly don't know what the question is. So I would love to see that actually in practice.
That would be an interesting test. And I'd want some of the judges to not just be common folk like us, you know, but people who are experts in the field, you know, because my man puking into toilet as rendered by Picasso, you know, it looks like a Picasso to me, but I'm not a Picasso scholar. Picasso scholar might say that is nothing even close to Picasso. That matters too, I think.
It also occurs to me that we are talking about generative AI as if it is frozen in time in terms of the tools that we see in front of us. And I think recent experience has taught us that what we see in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years' time might completely change how we think about this field.
Yes.
Because what I'm seeing on my desktop right now completely changes what I think of in terms of generative AI. So I'm fascinated and I'm eager, and I'm also a little frightened to see what comes next.
Yep. And that's precisely why I said, let's reconvene when it becomes sentient.
Okay.
I'm only half joking about that.
Yeah. And, fingers crossed it will not refer to itself as Skynet.
Yeah. Good topic. I enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So thank you for taking us through that.
So I'm going to give you your question for next time. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Going to lighten this up a little. We're fast approaching the December holiday season, what my favorite political satirist Roy Zimmerman calls Chris Mahana Rama Kadana Kwanzaa. Now, I've told you and our audience numerous times that my single favorite episode of Mansplaining is the one we did about Christmas. We taped it 2 years ago this month.
Yes.
It's episode 12, The Thing About Christmas, for anyone who wants to listen to it. I listened to it again recently. I really think it's a fun, funny, interesting conversation. I encourage anybody who's curious about Christmas to listen to it. But for next time, Mark, I figured I'd ask you about that other day we celebrate at this time of year. I read somewhere that New Year's Day is the closest thing we have to a truly global holiday. That confused me since different ethnic and religious groups like Jews, for example, celebrate a different New Year that never lines up with January 1st.
Sure.
I know that a calendar year marks the time it takes the Earth to make one revolution around the sun, but the Chinese celebrate the Lunar New Year, which just adds to my confusion. So, Mark, I was hoping you could mansplain to me and our listeners, given all these differences, why does the world coalesce around January 1st as the beginning of the year?
Okay, I'll take that on. I have no idea what the answer is, so I'm looking forward to discovering it.
And I'm sure the answer will not be as dystopic as many of our other recent topics. So that's why I'm confident in sending you off on this trek.
Well, thank you for that. So if you have any thoughts on this episode, or you'd like to leave in comments on previous episodes, we do have a Facebook page, and you can find it at Mansplaining the Podcast. I hope you come by, like our page, leave a few comments, or even pose a question, and we might answer in a future episode.
This episode of all the episodes would be a good one to check out the sources, because there's a lot of interesting journalism in which tech writers use the image and text generating apps and came up with really interesting works of art and fiction. And we'll include links to the AI apps themselves so you could play with it yourself. And if we're somehow able to figure this out, we'll also put the images that I generated when I played with it, including the already mentioned man puking into toilet as rendered by Picasso, which you will enjoy looking at.
If you'd like to help other people discover this podcast, one of the best things you can do, aside from going to the top of the building that you're in right now and shouting the word mansplaining to the people on the street below, is to leave a rating and a review on iTunes or Spotify or Google Play or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. If you haven't reviewed us and if you love us, then please go on one of these platforms and give us the love. It does help other people discover mansplaining and sends the good of mansplaining out into the world.
Agreed.
But that's it for this week. I'm Mark, and that was Joe. And thank you for spending some time with us.
Talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.